So, uh, wow. Actually, I have a month off. So, actually, no, I'll still be here, but you won't like hear from me on a Wednesday night for a month. So, what we're gonna do, we're doing our new series. It's called Connect, and instead of me teaching, we're gonna have students. We're gonna have you guys be doing the lessons for the rest of this month and the first week of March. And it's really important that you guys have opportunities to be able to shine because one day you guys are going to be the future leaders of our churches. You guys are going to be the future worship leaders in our churches. You guys are going to be the future teachers in our churches. So what we want to do here is give you opportunities to learn how to do that. So tonight, Ben is going to do our very first lesson.
Can you hear me now? All right, that's good. Let me get my notes out. I'm not like Daryl, I can't preach without notes or talk without notes. So I'd first like to start off just saying I'm kind of nervous. I don't mind necessarily talking in front of people, but it's completely different to teach in front of people. But, you know, several weeks ago, Daryl talked, he had a lesson, and he talked about how it's a good thing to have a little bit of nervousness in your heart when you're doing things for God, because it gets you out of your comfort zone. Because many times I feel like, and this is myself, I feel like we just live in kind of a bubble, and we don't want to get outside our comfort zone. And then we say, you know, Christianity is boring, or like, why is this life boring? You know, it's because we're not stretching ourselves, and we're not nervous because we're inside a little bubble, we're not outside our comfort zones. So that's just a quick little challenge before I actually get into my lesson, and it actually really comforted me to know that it's okay to be nervous. So a little nervous, but you know, I've had a lot of people come up and said they're praying for me, and that really, really helps to know that you have a lot of people praying, and that I'm doing this for God. So my lesson, the title of it would be Why Christianity is Not a Blind Faith. And I'm going to be talking about two main points in my lesson. The first one is, why is it more reasonable than not that there's a God? Because that's the first thing you have to establish in apologetics. You have to establish that there is a God. And then if there is a God, why Christianity? And why is that the more reasonable religion? Or why is God the God of Christianity? And so I first want to talk about why I'm doing this lesson and why I did it. So you heard Daryl talk about Sean McDowell. And if you ever met him, you heard him. And he went up and he posed as an atheist. And he had people asking questions, and he gave responses to their questions. And then he asked people questions, and it was really kind of scary because I didn't have answers to them. And I was kind of like, he's just kind of tearing apart my whole faith, you know, that I believed in. And it was because I didn't know, you know, why I believe things. And, I mean, Sean McDowell could probably argue any religion because, I mean, he was very confident, and people had some good arguments. But they even used his own book the one time, and that was kind of funny. But he did a really good job. But it was kind of scary. And I think we're at the age, you know, middle school and high school, where we need to realize why we believe things. And we shouldn't have our parents' faith. And I feel like I didn't necessarily have my parents' faith. I had my own faith, but the reasons for why I believe things were my parents' reasons, you know. I didn't actually think things through as much as I should, you know, and we should do that. And I didn't love God enough with my mind. That was a big thing. And so I'm going to read from Luke 10:27 real quick. Oh, it's up there. Nice. Okay. So I'm going to read Luke 10:27. And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And so I felt like I loved God with my heart, my soul, my strength, but I was kind of lacking the mind aspect of that. And so after Sean McDowell talked, I asked Daryl if he would help me go through questions, and so I could just love God with my mind more and strive to do that. And so Daryl and I started meeting. We'd meet every week or every 2 weeks, and he'd ask me a question, and I'd go through that week or 2 weeks, and I would look up the answer and like find it through the Bible, throughout different sources. Then we'd meet again, and we'd talk about what I learned, and I had my opinion. And then he would tell me if I was wrong in places or stuff. We'd just talk about it. And then he asked me another question, and I'd go through the same thing. And I'm going to talk about tonight Daryl's first two questions that he gave me. And these are the two things I mentioned earlier. And it kind of gives us a base level for our Christian faith before we can believe anything else. And so the first question he asked me is, why is it reasonable for a God to exist? Because that's the first thing we have to establish. Like I said, why is it reasonable for a God to exist? Because if we know a God exists, then we can look to see what religion. And so I went throughout that week and I looked for different arguments or clues, because you can't prove 100% there's a God, but it's definitely, you can get it to be where it's more reasonable than not than to believe in a God. And I think I gave like 6 or 7 different arguments or clues for the existence of a God, but I'm only going to say 3 tonight. I'll give you 3 that I thought were pretty compelling. They're the 3 main ones that you'll hear. And the first argument is the argument for a conscience. And this one is kind of cool because like everyone has a conscience. On some level or another, people may differ on what they think is right and wrong, but on some level, they know right from wrong. They may not do what is right and what is. They may do things that are wrong, but they know that they're wrong. And they may not feel convicted because they don't have the Holy Spirit. As believers, we have the Holy Spirit where we feel convicted. They may not have that, but they know the thing they're doing is wrong. And this goes like, if there isn't a God, then everything would be allowed and everything would be, would go. Like murder wouldn't be wrong. You'd see people robbing people because that wouldn't be wrong. We wouldn't establish that as a society. Because part of the society, we've established things are right and wrong because of conscience, And I'm also going to read from Romans 2:15 at this time. And you can't, when you're talking to an unbeliever, you can't use the Bible to prove or to give clues for a God. But as believers, we can use it to support, the reasons for God. And so this is Romans 2:15. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. And so this talks about how a law is written on people's hearts, and they have a conscience. So this kind of supports this argument for a conscience. And also, to go along with this, you can prove like facts, like material facts are things you can prove. But when you're talking about like morals and like a conscience, you can't necessarily prove why something is right or wrong. Like, why is it wrong to steal? It just kind of it is. Like, you can't really prove it. And it's almost like you feel it on the inside. Like, you know that this is wrong, and it almost comes across as like a command, if that makes sense. Like you're saying to your conscience is saying, that's wrong. And you may do that thing, but you know it's wrong, but it's almost like a command. And commands always will have a commander. There's always someone who has written the command or has written that law, if you want to put it as a law. And so that commander, we would say, would be God or a higher being, and we would believe that that's the God of the Bible. And I'll get to that later about the Bible. So that's the first clue or argument. The second one is the cause and effect argument. And I'll explain this for those of you who don't know about the cause and effect argument. It's like, so a sword will not make itself. And I know that from experience because I have a forge. I recently built a forge, and I know that. Yep, I built a forge. And I know, Daryl's laughing. I see him. Anyway, forge. So I know that a piece of metal isn't just going to make itself into a forge. It takes, building that. And so after you make the sword becomes the effect, and the making of the sword would have been the cause. And so when we're talking about the reason for God in this, we have to, we're talking about the universe. The universe would be the effect, just like the sword. We have to establish if the universe is an effect. And the universe, scientists found out, is constantly expanding. So it's constantly going out. So that means it would have had to have a starting point. So it had to come together. So there had to have been a cause because it's a material effect. And the thing about this, people would say, well, then God would have to have been caused, But the thing is, you can't go back infinitely. There had to have been a starting point somewhere. And because God made the universe, he is above its laws, so he was always there. So something can't come from nothing, but so God was always there, and he's above our universe's laws. And I'm going to state the law of cause and effect, just so now that you know kind of what cause and effect, what that is. Remember the sword and the forge, the making of the sword. And the law of cause and effect states that every material effect must have an adequate cause. And the material effect, the universe would be a material effect, so it would have had to have had an adequate cause. And that cause would be God, or a higher being. And like I said earlier, we believe that God is the God of the Bible. So that's the second argument for God. I'm getting on to my third argument, and this is probably the one that would compel me the most if I wasn't a believer. And this one I thought was really cool because I hadn't really heard it before. And it's like every piece of intelligent information has an intelligent mind behind it. And so what you first have to do is establish what determines if information is intelligent. So intelligent information, it has to have a meaning and it has to make sense. Anybody can just type random letters and they may have the right kind of material, but it may not make sense and it's not in the right order. Like a sentence, to make sense, the words have to be in the right order, and the letters in the words have to be in the right order. And this goes along with every book has an author. With the author's intelligent mind, every magazine has a writer. Every work, would have an intelligent mind behind it if it's intelligent information. And I'm tying this in to a God because DNA is intelligent information. DNA is in our bodies. It acts as a genetic code. It's similar to a computer program. And it has information that our cells use. And the thing that makes DNA so special is the reason it's intelligent information is because everybody's DNA is almost exactly the same. It's made up almost of the exact same things. So you'd think that we should all look alike, right? But the thing that is different about DNA in our bodies is the order of it. So it means that it has intelligent information because it makes sense to our bodies, and it has meaning because of different order. And so if we've determined that DNA is intelligent information, there has to have been an intelligent mind that formed that intelligent information, and that would be God, or a higher being. And that thing I thought was crazy, that argument, because I hadn't really heard that before. I thought that was really cool. And so if we've used those three, and there are more that you can look up if you want. You can even talk to me afterwards and ask questions after youth. But if we've established that there is a God, we have to figure out which religion he is the God of, or if it's more probable than not that there's a God. Because you can't, like I said, you can't 100% prove that there's a God, but it can be more reasonable than not. So this goes along with Daryl's second question he asked me. He asked, if it's more reasonable than not than there is a God, because that was the first week's question, then he asked me, how do we know that he's the God of Christianity? And I thought about this for a week or two, and I came to the conclusion that the reason Christianity is more reasonable than not, and I believe it's correct, is because of the resurrection. A lot of religions base what they believe off their scriptures, and their faith is based off their scriptures. But Christianity, it's based off an event. It's based off the resurrection of Christ. And I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 15, 14 through 17. I'm going to read these verses, and they tie in. And this is Paul. He's writing. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God, that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you're still in your sins. So that definitely says, Paul says, Christianity is based off the resurrection. If there's no resurrection, then there's no Christianity. You might as well, not believe in the God of the Bible at all, because if the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is false. He even says that we're misrepresenting God if there's no resurrection, and that's a pretty big deal. So all you have to do to disprove Christianity is to disprove the resurrection. And remember, it only has to be more reasonable than not that Jesus was raised. And I watched the movie. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie or read the book, A Case for Christ. But if any of you have read or watched the movie, you'll see it's about this reporter, and he's an atheist, and his wife's an atheist, and she becomes a Christian, and he didn't like that. So he goes out and tries to disprove Christianity because he doesn't want her to be a Christian. And so he asks people, he's like, what would I have to do to disprove Christianity, and they told him, go after the resurrection. If you disprove the resurrection, then Christianity is false. So he tried to do that. But in the end, he actually found out that it was more reasonable for him to believe. And he didn't have, like, a great moment. It was, like, the truth to him. Like, it was, like, the truth that the resurrection happened. And he ended up becoming a believer. So I thought that was really cool. So moving on to the resurrection. So why is the resurrection more reasonable than not to have happened? And you first have to establish that Christ actually died. Because if Christ didn't die, then he wouldn't have been raised. And he could have just, gotten out of the tomb and he wouldn't have been raised. He would have just been alive. So you have to establish that he died. And the thing is, Christ, he was beaten twice before he was hung on a cross. And people would die sometimes even being beat once because they would use a cat of nine tails whip. And if you don't know what that is, it's a whip that has shards of glass and just all kinds of debris and sharp objects that are in it. I mean, sometimes nails, I guess. But what they'd whip you, and you can imagine whenever they'd pull it off, just the effect that it would have. It was gruesome and it was terrible. And he wasn't only beat once; he was beaten twice. So that took an enormous toll on his body, and he probably lost so much blood. So that happened. And some people even died during that. Would have died then. And then he was hung on a cross where he had railroad spikes driven through his wrists. And you know what a railroad spike is, how painful and how much damage that would do to your body. He had them nailed through his wrists and one through his feet. And then he was hung on a cross. And if you know anything about crucifixion, you would suffocate, and that's how you would die. And some people could hang for 3 days. But you have to remember, he was beaten twice. And that was a big thing. So he hung, I think, it was around 3 hours he hung on the cross or something around that. And so he was beaten twice, and then he was hung on a cross. And so you may say, well, there's maybe a possibility he could have been alive after they took him down. He could have still survived somehow through that. So there may be a slight possibility he didn't die. But then not only that, after all this happened, they took a spear and they stabbed him in the side. And then after they did that, water and blood separated, which would mean his heart ruptured. And so you can't really fake that kind of a death. So he couldn't fake his death. So Christ died. So we established that. And then you have to establish, where did his body go? Because it was gone. And people will agree with that his body wasn't there anymore. And so many people saw him after he was dead. The disciples, and there's many other accounts of people that saw him. And so some people would argue that people had mass hallucination. Everyone just hallucinated that Christ was raised. And, that's impossible. For that many people to have the same hallucination and to agree on the same, it wouldn't be possible. I've heard atheists say that it would be more possible for someone to be raised from the dead than to have that many people hallucinate of the same thing. And some people claim that the disciples took his body out and hid it and then just claimed that he was alive. And other people saw him, so that may not work. But to go along with that, 10 out of the 11 disciples, not including Judas, because Judas ended up actually killing himself, but 10 out of the 11 disciples died for their faith. And you think people will die for their faith all the time for different religions. Radical Muslims, they'll die for what they believe in, but they didn't see their whole faith. Remember, because we said their whole Christians, their whole faith is based off the resurrection. That's Christ. So all the disciples saw their faith die, but yet they went on to die for it. So why would you do that? You're thinking, why would they die for something for their faith when they saw it die? And that was the thing that really caught my attention. And I was like, people wouldn't die for something that they knew was a lie. Like, you wouldn't die for a lie if you knew it was a lie, right? Does that make sense, people? Make sense? Okay, yeah. Because I thought that was a really strong argument. And if I wasn't a Christian, if I believed in a God and I wasn't a Christian, knowing this would really sway me and really get me to think about this. Because this really shows that it would be more probable than not that Christ had been raised because of all these things that happened. And right now I'm going to invite the band to come back up. as I close with my last point. So we've established with 3 reasons that it's more reasonable than not that there is a God. And we've established that it's more reasonable than not that Christianity is correct. So, if you establish both of these things, then, Christianity really isn't a blind faith at all. I thought that was pretty cool. And if you have any questions about this, you can see me after youth and talk to me about it. But we'll let the band go ahead.
Thanks, Ben.